Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, slightly detouring from our pilgrimage series as we look towards France and the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a spectacular event dating from June 1520, when King Henry VIII of England met with his counterpart Francis I of France in the hopes that diplomatic relations could be improved and perhaps an alliance could be formed against the imposing and ever-growing influence of the Holy Roman Empire and its imperial leader Charles V. So let's see what happened and if an alliance was actually set. King Henry VIII arrived at the port of Calais on the 1st of June 1520, having travelled from the port of Dover. Interestingly enough, the port itself, as well as the wider Pale of Calais, as it was then called, was under the English possession, having been so since about 1359-1360, during the time of the Hundred Years' War, where it was besieged by the forces of Edward III. Henry VIII would then travel 10 kilometres south of the port to the castle at Guisnes. Henry VIII arrived at Guisnes on the 4th of June 1520. Following his arrival at Guisnes, Henry VIII sent off Thomas Wolsey, the great organiser to this grand, spectacular event. Henry VIII sent Cardinal Wolsey to basically go find Francis I and tell him, well, that we were ready, the English were ready for the diplomatic talks. Thomas Wolsey didn't actually have to travel a great distance to find Francis I, because the French king was actually about 8 or 9 kilometres east of Guisnes at the town of Ard. But it wasn't until the 7th of June 1520 that finally these two counterparts met at the sort of midway point, at the place which we synonymously call the Field of the Cloth of Gold. This site, which was set within the French countryside, spread across 12,000 acres. This was basically the erection of a small city. There were temporary palaces built for the respective kings. The attendants were given a series of tents to reside in themselves. There were thousands of attendants, and so thousands of tents in turn. There were places for jousting, there were places for drinking, there were places for feasting. There were stables where hundreds of horses had to be kept, not just for the jousting events that are a spectacle in themselves, but just getting around this 12,000 acre site, and of course travelling to the site itself. Reportedly, there were 2,200 sheep consumed over this 17-day period at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. And that, combined with all the other food, all the other meat and animals that would have been consumed at the event, well, you need to keep them somewhere as well. So pens, storage, keeping things cool and everything else like that. That takes up a lot of space in itself. And all the fabric, or most of the fabric at least, was woven with the thing that is pretty much the namesake of this event, cloth of gold, or gold cloth, which is gold threads woven within silk fabric. Now, a large and grand and probably expensive event such as this would cost Henry VIII £35,000, quite a fair amount of his sort of yearly budget that he would aside for the royal court. And whilst we don't quite know how much Francis I spent on his own sort of palaces, etc., we can probably assume that it was roughly a similar amount, because the whole point of this event, whilst being an air of diplomacy, it was all about trying to outdo one another, Who could spend the most? Who could be the best and show off the most prowess and power of a king can have? Even the jousting events and the other spectacular sporting occasions at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, they weren't just moments for entertainment. They were trying to determine who was the better king, who had the better soldiers, the most courageous, the most knightly. All in all, this was an event. Not much of a diplomatic discussion with a round table or anything like that. This was an event, and a spectacular one at that. Now, in order to create such a great event as this, well, it requires a great deal of planning, especially on the part of Thomas Wolsey, who probably delegated to a lot of individuals, but did a lot of the legwork himself. The earliest references to an event being organised or taking place was in March of 1519. So we're talking a good 15 months in advance of the actual event itself. So it's no real different to when organising a festival or a sporting occasion or any big event that we would have in today's world. Now, the first thing that would be organised or indeed negotiated was, well, who's going? Who's going to be at this great event? Now, it turns out that anyone who was anyone within the French and English courts was going to be at this spectacular Field of the Cloth of Gold. Now, to name them all would take a video in itself. It would be quite long and it would be quite boring. I'd likely lose my voice. So for the next 30 seconds, I'm going to quick fire list some of the biggest names that were at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Maybe you recognise a few, maybe you have no idea who any of these people are. But I'm going to show you anyway, just as I say, for 30 seconds. So time starts now. In the 17 days that this event sat within, there was a great number of sporting events: wrestling, archery, sword fighting, and most prestigious of all, jousting. This event was just a giant tournament. It was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting between these two kings, an alliance in the making. And whilst during these 17 days the French king and the English king got on very well, nothing was signed, nothing was negotiated, and nothing really happened. As I said, this was more of a tournament, a sporting event, more than it was an actual diplomatic meeting. The only moment of political messaging that we can really sort of define was when Queen Catherine of Aragon, the English queen, who was very rarely seen in the stands at the jousting tournaments, was seen wearing Spanish clothing, her hair done in the Spanish fashion, pretty much engaging herself as the true Spaniard that she was. Political messaging has been interpreted as Catherine wanting to push for a Spanish policy, perhaps a triumvirate of leaders in alliance and not just a duo. For Charles V, the King of Spain, was also the Holy Roman Emperor. His lands encompassed large swathes of Europe and could be described as a superpower within the continent. So England should not be vying for the separate attentions of Charles V or Francis I. They should work together as a sort of triple alliance. And indeed, Francis I and France as a nation should not be at the brink of war with Charles V and his large superpower. and indeed run the risk of another war with Henry VIII, who could ally themselves with the great superpower. They should be together again in this triple alliance. In fact, this policy of a triple alliance, as it were, was actually what the Pope over in the Vatican wanted as well. He wanted these powers to band together to push back the impending threat on Eastern Europe by the ever-growing Ottoman Empire, based in Constantinople and the Middle East. Now, one of the final moments of the 17 days of eventing, which has become a bit of a legendary moment within the field of the cloth of gold narrative, was a wrestling match wherein Henry VIII challenged Francis I. Now, here's where we run into a bit of a problem, because even before the kings had set foot on this 12,000-acre site, it was agreed that neither king was to take part in any of the sporting occasions. Because, well, for one thing, they could be injured or even accidentally killed, and that's not exactly a good thing. Plus, the sports themselves, like jousting, weren't exactly the most health and safety conscious of events. But it was more to do with reputation, embarrassment, and perhaps not trying to drive into either king's arrogance or ego. But Henry VIII dived deep into that arrogance and egotism by challenging Francis I to a wrestling match. He thought he could outdo the French king, who was more known for his musical prowess, his love of poetry, and indeed the patronage of Leonardo da Vinci. Whereas Henry VIII, well, he had spent his youth jousting, taking part in various sporting occasions, and was quite an intimidating and large individual. Now, whilst we don't have a blow-by-blow commentary of what happened during this match, we do at least know its outcome. And that is to say that, well, Francis I won the match, causing great embarrassment and indeed great anger amongst the English and indeed the king himself. Following this wrestling match, the negotiations and diplomatic relations between the two countries began to crumble. Henry's ego had been bruised, Francis's had been boosted. Great embarrassment and great pride in respective nations were being felt. And so on the 24th of June 1520, the two respective kings left the field of the cloth of gold, and the site cleared of any remnants of this event taking place. But before Henry VIII made his way back to the Palace of Placentia, his sort of courtly home in Greenwich, London, he would make a small stop at Gravelines, just east of Calais, the port of Calais that is, to meet again with his imperial Holy Roman Emperor counterpart, Charles V. So in the next video, I'll be going through some of the smaller and indeed cheaper details about this second meeting between Henry VIII and Charles V, before moving slightly ahead in our history to the middle of 1522, when Charles V made a state visit to England. But for now, I wish you all a pleasant day and see you next time.